Hi, I'm really gutted to not be at the conference there with all of you, because I think the work you're doing is unbelievably important and is exactly what we need to be talking about right now in Britain. I wanted to record this video really to touch on a few different things that a lot of you will know about, but that I think should be really important parts of the British drug debate, and currently are not. So we have an enormously high level of drug deaths, overdose deaths in Britain at the moment. And I've been to countries that had comparable levels of drug overdoses and massively reduced them, brought those deaths down enormously, according to the best scientific studies. And I want to talk to you a bit about what those places did, very closely related to what you're fighting for at the conference, and some general lessons I think we can learn from those places. So the reason I cared about this is because we had addiction in my family. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was too young to understand why then, but as I got older, I realised we had addiction in my family. And so for my book, Chasing the Scream, I ended up going on a really big journey all over the world. I travelled over 30,000 miles. I wanted to sit with the leading experts in the world on addiction and go to places that adopted radically different approaches from the places that had the toughest possible policies. Like in Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to go out on a chain gang wearing t-shirts saying I was a drug addict, while members of the public mock them and jeer at them. Vietnam, where they make people with addiction problems, put them into forced labour camps, gulags, and to places that have the most compassionate possible policies, which I want to focus on in talking to all of you. And I learned a huge amount from this. There's one place in particular I want to focus on, because I think it's neglected in the international drug debate, certainly neglected in the British debate, and we really need to learn about it, not least because the breakthrough they made there was inspired by something that happened in Britain that I want to talk about. So the country I'm talking about is Switzerland, and as you can probably tell from my name, my dad was from Switzerland. I'm a Swiss citizen as well as a British citizen. It's a country I know well. So in the year 2000, Switzerland had one of the worst drug crises in the world. Massive heroin epidemic, and a lot of people will remember news footage from around that time. So there were these really kind of dystopian seeming scenes in cities like Zurich and Geneva and Thun and Bern of very chaotic street use in public parks. People shooting up openly in public, people injecting in the neck, really uncomfortable scenes of distressed people that went all over the world. And Switzerland is a really conservative country. My Swiss relatives make Jacob Rees-Mogg look like Tony Benn. And Switzerland's initial response to this outbreak, Swiss people in particular are obsessed with order. So to them, this chaotic street scene, it's not coincidence the Swiss invented clocks, right? To them, this is like a nightmare. And their response to this heroin crisis was initially very repressive, effectively the American drug war approach. Send the police in to arrest, harass, bully people, put them on trial, imprison them. They tried that for years, and every year the problem kept getting worse and worse. They tried other things. They tried a kind of unhelpful form of harm reduction because it was so limited, where they would just round up the drug users and push them into specific parks, but give them no help, and they're still in an overall context of extreme prohibition and shame and so on. And so none of these approaches worked. And then Switzerland got its first female president. She was initially the Minister of Health, then the female president. Totally incredible person, my candidate for President of the World, Ruth Dreifuss, who looked at all the best science. She's a very scientifically minded person, spoke to all the groups affected, including a lot of drug users. And Ruth said to the Swiss people, I think I know the solution to this problem. I think we need to legalise heroin. And at first, as she said to people, when I explain this, you're going to think I'm crazy. Just hear me out, right? She said, when you hear the word legalisation, what you picture is like anarchy and chaos. What we have now, she explained, is anarchy and chaos. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown drug users, all in the dark, all filled with violence, disease and chaos. Legalisation, she said, is the way I propose to restore order to this chaos. And it's important to understand what legalisation doesn't mean, right? So nobody was suggesting the legalisation of heroin on the model that we've legalised alcohol in our societies, for example, right? So you think about in Britain, where I live most of the time in London, it's legal for me to own a dog, a monkey and a lion, right? They're all legal, but they're legal in different ways, right? The rules are different. Obviously, I can just go into a shop and buy a dog. To buy a monkey, I'm pretty sure I need a license. And to have a lion, well, I can't have one in Crouch End where I live, and they'd come and inspect my house and make sure I'm not a mad person, right? The bar is really high. So they're all legal, but they're legal in different ways. No one is suggesting that there should be a heroin aisle in Boots. That's not the plan, right? So the model of legalisation that Ruth Dreyfus was proposing, that she then implemented with the support of many different parts of the Swiss political system, where power is spread quite diffusely, was this. So I went to see it in practice. So I'll tell you about the clinic in Geneva, because it's the one that I went to. So, and spent a fair bit of time in as a journalist. So there's a clinic, it's in Geneva. The former president, President Dreyfus, lives very close to this clinic. If you've got a heroin problem, you're assigned to this clinic. We're given a range of options, but one of them is that you can be assigned to this clinic. You go to the clinic, you have to go at 7 o'clock in the morning, because Swiss people believe in doing things insanely early. This is a constant source of disagreement between me and my dad. You turn up at 7 o'clock in the morning, you go in and you're given your heroin there for free. It's medically pure heroin, not the contaminated shit you'd buy on the street. You're given it there and you have to use it there. You can't take it out with you, partly because they don't want you to sell it on, and also because they want to medically monitor you. So you use your heroin there with clean needles they provide, with the free heroin they provide, and then you leave and you go to your job, because you're given loads of support to get housing, to get therapy, and to get work. And there are lots of things that really fascinated and surprised me about this program when I first went there. One of the things that really shocked me was, I remember Dr. Rita Mangi, who ran the clinic when I was there, chief psychiatrist at the time, explained to me, so if you're on that program, they'll give you any dose you want, except for one that would literally kill you. So you set your own dose, and there is never any pressure to cut back. You can stay on that program as long as you want. But when I went there, the clinic had, this particular service, the legal heroin service, had been in place for 13 years, and there were I think it was 2 people who'd been on the program at the start who were still on it. And I remember saying to Dr. Mangi, well, how can that be? Because we're told if you use heroin, the chemical hooks take you over, you need more and more of them. Surely if you were given a free and infinite supply, you would just carry on taking more and more, and you'd never stop. And Dr. Mangi looked at me and she said, well, we help them so their lives get better. And as their lives get better, they don't want to be anaesthetised so much. Which seems so kind of obvious when I first learned it. I thought this, and yet it's so conflicted with so many things I was told. It made me realise I'd have to rethink some of the quite basic things I'd been told and had believed and indeed thought I'd seen in front of me when it came to addiction. The results from the Swiss programme are really clear. It's now 16 years since this programme began. Anyone in the audience, I urge you to shout out, how many people do you think have died of heroin overdoses on legal heroin in Switzerland in the 16 years this programme has been in place? The answer is nobody. Not one person, not a single person. Best research on this is by Dr. Ambrose Uchtenhagen, although other work has been done that's really good by people like Johann. The other figures are really striking. So there remains some heroin use in the illegal market, but it has declined year on year on year as people transfer into the legal program, because who wants to run around raising hundreds of euros a day to buy a shitty inferior product when you can get the better legal stuff for free and get loads of help, right? And again, so like I say, Switzerland, really conservative country. After this program had been in place for 2 years under President Dreyfus, they had a referendum on this to see should we continue. And 70% of Swiss people voted to keep heroin legal. Not because Swiss people are so compassionate, that, to be honest, they're not. It was for several reasons. Firstly, it's much cheaper to do this than to send people to prison. And secondly, crime fell enormously. I go through the full statistics in my book on this, Chasing the Scream, but crime really substantially fell because people weren't having to feed street habits, right? This experiment in Switzerland was only possible because of something that happened in Britain. And I think it's worth thinking about that because I know lots of people at this conference are involved in arguing for reform. And in an area like drug policy, we have one step forward, one step back, we save some lives and then we're stopped from doing it. There's a churn of this. And I think it's really important to understand that even what seem like temporary advances that are taken away can have a real ripple effect. So why did the Swiss experiment happen? It happened because several leading Swiss social scientists came to Widnes in the north of England outside Liverpool, and they saw an experiment that happened there. And they came back and they told President Dreyfus about it, and it led to this the possibility of this opening in Switzerland. So what happened is, in the 1920s, the United States was basically pressuring every country in the world to shut down any legal access to a whole range of drugs that they had designated as kind of evil, one of which was heroin. And Britain was one of the very few countries that kind of pushed back a little bit. And British doctors behaved in a really heroic way, where they insisted that there be carved out an exception, which was people who are addicted to heroin should be given a medical supply of heroin for as long as they need it. This was an insistence by British doctors, a real rebellion, and the British government couldn't repress them. So this tiny window of light of a safe legal supply was kept open. Now, not many people got access to it, but some did over the years. It was kind of rocked a bit in the 60s. So you got to the point where in the early 1980s, there were only a handful of places that were still prescribing in any substantial way. One was in Widnes, a wonderful doctor I interviewed a lot for my book named Dr. John Marks, who really kept open this window, had a clinic where he'd actually expanded the heroin prescription program. Deaths in Widnes had really substantially fallen. You had lots of people whose lives were being turned around by a legal prescription. And this model kind of got a lot of international attention. It's why these Swiss social scientists came to see it. That also attracted negative attention. There was big pressure from the American government. 60 Minutes, huge American TV show, came to Widnes, filmed what was happening, and it caused a lot of pressure, and the Conservative government in the early 1990s shut down this program. And many people thought, oh, well, this has been a disaster, even though the results were very clear, we had this progress and it was shut down and now it's just been a disaster. But actually, this moment of light, this moment of progress inspired people who no one was picturing in Widnes when they did it, led to a whole country legalising heroin with all of those results that we can now see very clearly and have been documented very well. And again, that is going to inspire other people and other people and other people. So even those of you in the audience who are fighting for reform, who've had moments of reform that were taken away, remember that those moments of reform can have ripple effects that you may never see, but that will carry on saving people's lives. I think when we think about the Swiss experiment, I think it really helps us to see some key principles about addiction treatment and addiction more generally that it's really worth us thinking about as we go forward and we argue for changes in Britain. So my whole approach to this was really changed by an amazing social scientist I got to know. And I think we can think about Switzerland in relation to this. So certainly it's how it helped me to understand what I'd seen in Switzerland and then what I'd seen in my own family in Britain. So if you'd asked me, when I started doing the research for the book, what causes heroin addiction? I would have looked at you like you were thick and I would have said, well, the clue's in the name, mate, right? Obviously, heroin causes heroin addiction. We've been told this story for 100 years. It's become totally part of our common sense. It was certainly part of mine, and this is partly why what I saw in that clinic seemed initially baffling. So we think, I'm in upstate New York as I record this. We think if I kidnapped the next 20 people to walk past this hotel in upstate New York, and I injected them all with heroin every day for a month, like a villain in a Saw movie. At the end of that month, they'd all be addicted to heroin for a simple reason: that there's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically need. They'd have this tremendous physical hunger for heroin. And that's what addiction is, right? The desperate craving for the chemical hook. That's why we call it being hooked. Now, that story's not totally wrong, but it turns out to be a surprisingly small part of what's happening in addiction. We know this for many reasons, partly because of the ordinary medical experience in Britain, right? So in Britain, as you know, if I step out into the street and get hit by a truck and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital, and it's likely I'll be given a lot of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin, right? It's much better than the contaminated shit you buy on the streets. It's medically pure heroin. People who've had hip replacement operations are given diamorphine. If your grandmother has had a hip replacement operation, she's taken a lot of really good heroin. If what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused primarily or entirely by these chemical hooks, what should be happening to all these people in British hospitals who are exposed to diamorphine? Some of them should be leaving hospital and trying to score on the streets. This has been studied very carefully. It virtually never happens. So I remember when I first learned that, thinking, well, that just can't be right. How could you have a situation where you have, someone in a hospital bed who's been given quite a lot of potent heroin? They don't become addicted, but you've got someone in the alleyway outside shooting up who does become addicted. How could that be? What's going on there? And I only really began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and I met an amazing social scientist named Professor Bruce Alexander, who explained to me this theory we have, not totally wrong theory, that addiction is driven primarily by the chemical hooks, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You guys could try them at home tonight if you feel a little bit sadistic. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's our story. But in the 1970s, Professor Alexander was working with a lot of people with addiction problems on the downtown east side of Vancouver. He started asking himself, it doesn't seem to sound quite right about this. So he decided to do a different experiment. He decided to build a cage that he called Rat Park. Very different kind of cage. So the rats have lots of friends, they can have loads of sex, they've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they've got everything a rat could want in life. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. And of course they don't know what's in them, they try both. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use and overdose when they don't have the things that make life worth living, to none when they do have the things that make life worth living. Now there's loads of human examples of this. I go through a lot of them in Chasing the Scream. To me, what this taught me is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, important though that is to many people. The opposite of addiction is connection. Everyone knows they have natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And this culture we've built is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today. But for many people, we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. Yet the core of addiction is not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. And once you understand that, you can see why this prohibition-based approach that we've been taking in Britain for 100 years now is so ineffective. The theory of prohibition is we need to punish and shame people with addiction problems to give them an incentive to stop. But once you understand that pain is the driver of addiction, you can see why that, sometimes we say it doesn't work. The truth is much worse. It makes the problem worse. Everywhere I went where they adopted these brutal prohibition-based policies, addiction was getting worse and worse because it traumatizes people even more. Everywhere I went where they'd adopted policies based on love and compassion and turning people's lives around, it's not a magic bullet. There's plenty of problems still in Switzerland or Portugal where they decriminalised all drugs, took the money they used to spend on screwing people's lives up and turning their lives around. But it's drastically and dramatically better, which is why all the scientific evidence shows that, and it's why public opinion began to change. So I guess the core of what I wanted to say to all of you at the conference is, this is such an urgent fight. You know that better than I do. There are solutions that work. Again, you know that better than I do. And the one thing you can say in defense of the approaches that we've taken is we've given them a fair shot, right? I'm in the United States at the moment. The United States has fought a drug war for 100 years. They've spent $1 trillion on it. They've imprisoned millions of their own citizens. They've destroyed whole countries like Colombia and El Salvador that I went to. And at the end of all that, they can't even keep drugs out of their prisons where they pay people to walk around the perimeter the whole time. That approach will never work. We have tried the approaches based on shame and punishment to absolute destruction. There are alternatives. They work really well. I've seen them in practice. You should all be so proud of fighting for those alternatives and standing up for the vulnerable people in Britain who desperately need our help and deserve love and compassion and deserve to live and have good lives. And there are policies that can help them to do that. For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about people with addiction problems. I think we should have been singing love songs to them all along. Thank you so much.